Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back with you this evening and to talk about, I think, a very important topic and certainly a very timely topic in our world right now, which is helping children and families build resilience. And we're going to look at that concept of resilience, and we're going to, like I like to do, go over certain pragmatic strategies that families can utilize to help children and adolescents build resilience and be ready to deal with challenges in front of them. And this topic is pretty near and dear to my heart. I mean, I have been a school counselor for over 10 years, and I continue to provide consultation to school districts all over the state of Pennsylvania and beyond, actually. And, you know, a lot of times this is what teachers want to know about. This is what families want to know about. You know, their children are struggling with different challenges in their lives. And how do they help them get over that hurdle? And of course, right now we're dealing with COVID-19 and the disruptions that has made to the routines of children and adolescents. And there's still, even as we speak together tonight, so many things up in the air about the upcoming school year and how that's going to work, as you as parents well know. So I'm willing to entertain your questions in that regard. But I did want to go over some real, I think, interesting things that research has told us, and I want to share that with you this evening. So again, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about are what's described as the 4 developmental assets, and sometimes these are known as protective factors. Okay, there's 40 of them, and these developmental assets, they've been called a framework of hope because if we are able to teach, instruct, instill these assets in our children and our adolescents, the research has shown, and we're going to go over that research, that it helps in so many profound ways. So we're going to talk about those. So some of the goals for our presentation this evening, before I get to that, I wanted to say that, you know, as always, when I do these presentations, I have a lot of slides, a lot of PowerPoint slides. I may not get to all of them, and that's okay. I just want to make sure that the concepts that we do cover, they're covered in terms that we're all on the same page on. And so we may get to all of them, we may not. But at any rate, the goals are to understand the 40 developmental asset framework, what that means. Just understand the power of simple acts to change a young person's life potentially. And examine how the elements of developmental relationships and techniques to increase better outcomes for our children and adolescents. So what are developmental assets? Again, they're concrete, common sense, positive experiences and qualities essential to raising successful young people. So we're going to talk about what those are. In fact, they're listed for you. And before we get to them, these assets have the power during the critical adolescent years to have a big influence on the choices that teenagers make and to help them become more caring and responsible as they move into adulthood. So they categorize these 40 developmental assets and or protective factors. I want to use both terms because those terms are used interchangeably. Developmental assets or protective factors. So they have categorized them into 2 broad categories. What are the external assets that a young person can have and learn? And what are the internal assets that a young person can have? And so before we start to talk about those, I wanted to just mention this, that, you know, a lot of times when we talked about this concept of an individual having certain assets or that they are resilient in their lives, we sort of thought about it as almost like a fixed dimension. For a long time, people thought about, well, that person's either born resilient, they're born with those qualities that help them be resilient, or they're not. And what we have learned through research and through practice is that actually these resilience assets are things that can be introduced into a young person's life. They don't have to be born with them. They can be presented to them. They can be learned characteristics. And I think that's a really important difference in terms of what we learned about that. So these assets can be introduced, and they have a profound effect, like you're about to see, on how people do. And what they did was they did a study of 147,000 adolescents, children and adolescents. And what they wanted to see was why when presented with some type of challenges in their lives, or presented with a series of traumas or crisis in their lives, why do some children and adolescents go on to be successful and others struggle? And they basically are apt to get in trouble with three areas that they found. And one is get in trouble with substance use and abuse. I mean, we know how prevalent substance use and abuse is in our society. I would venture to say that every one of us knows somebody in our lives that abuses substances in some way. And, maybe we know several people. So we know it's a very real issue, and it's impacting our children. It's impacting our societies in a major way. So it's going to, the lack of having these protective factors can impact that aspect of a person's life. The second one is their achievement in school, like being able to graduate from high school, at least to have that in their lives. So it's impacting their ability to do that. And then the third, it's impacting their relationship with the law, so that they may get in trouble with the law in some way and get involved in the criminal justice system. So they looked at those three areas because those are really areas that put our young people at risk. And so we're going to talk about those and the effects of these developmental assets on their lives. But what they're saying is, first of all, there's external, like we said, assets, and that includes support. What support does a young person have? What empowerment activities do they have? What are the boundaries and expectations? And constructive use of time. And then the internal assets are what is their commitment to learning, their positive value system, their social competence, and their positive identity. And so here's all 40 of them. And we're not going to go over every one of these in detail, obviously, because if we did, it would take the whole presentation. It would take the whole hour. But they are available to you. And I think Christina will make this PowerPoint available, or this presentation where you could go back and relook at it. So I want you to think about these things, because under support, they're looking at things like, is there family support? And as we're going through these, I do want to reiterate this. I tend to reiterate this during all my presentations, that we're not asking any parents to be perfect parents. That, I'm a parent too. I know how difficult a job that is, and none of us are going to be perfect sages. So we may be able to supply some of these things. We may not. We may feel we're strong in some areas in helping our children. We may feel like in other areas we have to get better, and that's okay, because we're all on that journey to be the best people we can be and to be the best parents we can be. So I just want to kind of leave you with that, because I don't want people to feel overwhelmed about this. But, obviously family support is vital to the success of a young person. And families, don't try to think of a family maybe in a traditional sense. Like, it doesn't have to be two parents. It doesn't have to be, the dog and another sibling and extended family. That it doesn't have to be that. It just has to be whatever that family is constituted like, that family supplies support and love. So obviously that there's positive communication that can go back and forth. That if there are other adult relationships that a child can kind of relate to, that can be really important. And those, they mentioned non-parent adults. Maybe there's a neighborhood that is also provides support in some way. Is there a school climate that provides support? Or can a parent be involved in schooling in some way? And also, so looking at like, does the community, what community values does your particular neighborhood potentially offer, or extended neighborhood? Um, are there some roles that a young person can assume within the community to kind of feel good about themselves? Is there opportunities for young people to be of service? Is there a modicum of safety? Again, family boundaries. Are there clear boundaries in the family? Are there school boundaries, neighborhood boundaries, role models that a person can be exposed to? Are there some positive peer influence in a young person's life? Because, we know how important that is, both negative and positive peer influence. Um, Adolescents, teenagers, they tend to kind of look to their peers sometimes more than they do to us as adults. So we know how important that can be and influential. And are there high expectations? They don't have to be, like, we're not talking about unrealistic expectations, but are there high expectations for a young person to be successful on their own terms? So there are opportunities for all of us have a creative side, and in one way or another. Some of us don't feel like we're very creative, but maybe, we all have creative qualities. So are there the opportunities for young people to kind of be involved in those creative endeavors? Are there potentially youth programs they can be involved in? Is there a religious community that can support? Um, is there time spent at home sometimes that a young person can be there and enjoying the things that they like to do? And so then we're going to move into internal assets, and that can be achievement motivation, that a young person is motivated to do well. Maybe it's in school, maybe it's in athletics. So I know they're saying school. Not all young people do really exceedingly great in school, but is there the one thing in their lives that they are motivated to do well at? So in terms of school, I guess they're looking at the potential for people to be tied into school and not drop out early. And so are they engaged in some way? And if you think about it, when they talk about school engagement, if a young person in a school is bonded to one adult in that school, just one adult, that drops their potential to drop out of school by 50%. So it increases by 50% the chances that they'll stay involved in school. So does a person work on their homework a little bit each day? Does a young person say they care about the school in some way? Is there some reading, engaging in reading for pleasure in some way? Let's think about that reading for pleasure. Think about what a young person likes. Like I know my son didn't like to read very much, but he loved sports and he loved baseball. So I would buy him magazines that, baseball magazines. So then he could read that. So maybe it's video magazines. I know there's an over reliance on video games in our world now, but I mean, this is a little bit different. There's just something they can read about what they're interested in, because that's going to tie them into that whole idea of reading. So is there the opportunity for a young person to care about somebody else? Think about this idea of equality and social justice, that the young person places value on equality and caring about other people. And like this next generation coming up, it seemed like each generation had a little bit more of that kind of ideal, that value system instilled with them. And so I think young people now, having worked as a school counselor and working in schools, I really see that with young people, that they have that feel for social justice and equality. So I think that's really positive in their lives. So does a young person have convictions, stand up for their beliefs? And this idea of honesty, and sometimes they'll call this like when you have to be really honest, have an honest conversation with your kids, or maybe you have to have an honest conversation with anybody in your life, and it has the potential to be a tough one. Sometimes they'll call those courageous conversations. So I think that like maybe modeling those courageous conversations is important, to have those conversations with our kids and to hear back from them, that they can be honest, like even if there's consequences, right? When telling the truth isn't easy, maybe there's consequences, but being able to own up to um, being honest about their situation. So being able to give a child or a young person responsibility and have them accept it and take personal responsibility for it. And then that a young person would show some restraint, not using maybe a very early sexually active behaviors, or not engaging at a young age in alcohol or other drugs. Continuing on, planning and decision making, how to make plans and make decisions about their lives, that they feel some interpersonal competence, that a young person has an idea of empathy and sensitivity. Again, I think this next generation does pretty well with that, but there's some kids that it gets blocked for whatever reason, and maybe they don't have a lot of empathy. Sometimes they'll end up calling those kids bullies. Usually, when a child is a bully, they're a bully because they don't have empathy for their victims, and so it's helping individuals. So they're not a lost cause. Maybe they're they're showing some bullying behaviors, but they can learn other behaviors as well. So again, thinking about cultural competence, I think that the next generation is doing really well with that. That they resistance skills, peer pressure, how to handle or resist peer pressure, because that's a very real thing for kids nowadays, and that they're able to resolve their differences or resolve their conflicts in a peaceful way. So non-violently, but being able to negotiate, talk, mediate, things like that. Okay, that a young person feels that they have some personal power in their lives, because a lot of times people, especially young people, adults will too. They'll feel like, well, things just happen to me. I don't really have much control over that. And when they start to feel and talk that way, that they're lacking this sense of personal power in their lives. So that becomes an important thing. Along with that is self-esteem. That self-esteem can wax and wane over a lifetime, but that kids start to develop that self-concept so they can feel a good sense of self-esteem about themselves, that they have personal power in the world. And giving them a sense of purpose, like something that they're interested in or something that they want to work towards. And along with that, that a person can have some optimism about their future, right? And what's in store for them. So in thinking about those developmental assets, I know we went through those pretty quickly. Like I said, you're going to be able to go back and look at those. And I'm going to show you the power of those based on research here in a minute. Before we get to that, think about what kind of things stood out for you in terms of that information that we've talked about so far. Are there some things about this that give you hope? Are there some things about these developmental assets and what children need that surprised you? And are there some things that trouble you about it as well? So you can contemplate those. If you want to, you can put a reflection or a question in the chat. Okay, so I just put into a few slides some of the power of these developmental assets. And so if you look at this graph, this bar graph, what you're going to see is the lighter blue one is success in school. And then the darker blue, purple one is maintains good health. So what they found out is if a person only has 0 or 10 or less of these developmental assets in their life, they have only a 9% chance of succeeding in school. And they only have a 27% chance of maintaining good health Because, you know, they're looking at this, and you're going to see this across the board now. They're looking at not only not getting in trouble with the law, not using substances, but they're also looking at how these early experiences in their lives translate into good physical health throughout their life. So I think that's really important too. But anyway, only 27%. When you go up to a person having between 11 and 20 assets in their life, it goes up to 19% are going to succeed in school. 48% are going to maintain good health. When a person has between 21 and 30 of these assets, 34% are going to succeed in school. 69% are going to maintain good health. And then when you go up to a person having 31 to 40 of these assets in their life, it goes up to 54% are going to succeed in school, and 88% are going to maintain good health. And then we look at the power of these assets to protect a person, right? And so they're looking at alcohol use and violence. So if a person only has a 0 to 10 of these assets in their life, they have a 45% chance of use and abuse of alcohol and or other drugs. They have a 62% chance of getting involved in violence or other criminal activity. If a person has 11 to 20 of these assets in their life, then they only have a 26% chance of getting involved with alcohol or drug use and abuse, and a 38% chance of getting involved with criminal activity. When it goes up to 21 to 30 assets in their lives, only 11% for alcohol use and abuse, and only 18% for the possibility of criminal activity. Then you go up to 31 to 40 assets, only 3% to get involved with alcohol use or abuse, and only 6% to get involved in some type of criminal mischief. So there's a direct correlation between these assets in a person's life and how well they do later on. And I think that's fascinating, that we know this. And again, like I said, the study was done on 147,000 plus individuals, and they looked at this over time. So it was a longitudinal study. So so the good news is that we can use these assets to create a much better environment for our young people, right? And here's the challenge facing us. So they found out that the majority, so 17% of young people have between 0 and 10 of these assets in their life right now. 42% have between 11 and 20. 32% between 20 and 30. And only 8% between 31 and 40. So there's the challenge that if you add these two categories up, 0 to 10 and 11 to 20, that's 59% of our young people are at risk. And I don't think that that's any big revelation to us, because we know just raising kids and the challenges that kids face right now, that it's tough for them out there, you know. But this study also bears out the fact that this is true and this is happening, and it's a real dynamic. So let's look at, we're going to look at some things we can do. We're going to look at some of the psychology of where children and teenagers are, and then we're also going to look at some more things that we can do as families, as adults. Can we say one encouraging thing to our children every day? Sounds like an easy thing to do, but I mean, we get so busy in our lives and we're pulled so many directions that maybe that's something that we forget to do. But if we really put our minds to it, that is something we could and should do, because it really bears positive dividends for our kids, right? And then try to, you know, as adults, we feel like we have to do a lot of redirecting and a lot of teaching and instructing kids, and we do, you know, but it's also important to find out what are their thoughts about things? What are their opinions? And this slide too is talking about, like, in schools, we do a lot of telling kids what they should do, but we need to find out what their opinions are. And they are doing more of this. I know I was involved in anti-bullying concepts for a number of years, and now we're doing surveys in schools, because when you survey, this is fascinating. When you survey kids in a school about bullying, you learn everything about bullying. They tell you where bullying occurs, how it occurs, who's involved, the whole deal. And when you talk to teachers, they tend to say, well, we don't have that much bullying. And it's not that teachers don't care. It's just the whole concept of bullying is a little bit more subversive. It goes on underneath the radar sometimes, but it's something that's very real in the worlds of our children and our teenagers. So that we need to offer those opportunities to get feedback from kids, and they'll tell you. And I love that, because they're often uninhibited when they tell you about what's going on in their lives, if you provide the right opportunity. So we need to, that's part of empowerment. We should do more of that, because they have a lot to say, and they have a lot to teach us as well. Boundaries and expectations are important for kids, and especially, we know teenagers are always pushing those boundaries. They act like they don't want those boundaries in our lives. But deep down inside, children want boundaries. Teenagers want boundaries, because it helps them feel safe. They're not above being human. They're not above being dictated by the laws of what makes us human. And we know that having some expectations and boundaries in our lives reduces our anxiety. And it's true for teenagers and kids, even if they fight us on that, even if they push back on that, which they're almost certain to do. So think about that, like maintaining those expectations and boundaries. And then having this time to be constructive in terms of what they do with their time. And I know now more than ever, this is so challenging, because so many things are being postponed or they're up in the air, so many youth programs. So this is more challenging than ever. And as I say that we need to promote available programs, there may be less programs to promote, but there are things, and we have to, if nothing else, this whole pandemic with the crisis has kind of taught us that we have to look at different ways to do things. So I think we also have to be creative in terms of finding out what's available for our kids to be engaged in. Help children get tuned into the joy of learning. And I would recommend that you really plug them into things that they love. Even if you think it's too much of one thing, maybe that's the area that they want to research more about, read more about. And that becomes the joy of learning. And eventually, they'll find other things that they want to learn about and that provide them joy to learn about. This whole idea of positive values can be instilled by reminding children that mistakes are a part of living and growing. So are any of us, well, that's just a silly question, because none of us are free from making mistakes in our lives, right? In fact, we probably learn more from our mistakes than from things we did well. So just remind our kids that it's okay to make mistakes, that they can learn from those. But the important thing is that they do learn from them. Social competencies, children need to be, start to get in touch with their emotions and how to handle those. So as parents, we need to be more supportive and more gentle in responding to the fact that, is there going to be some moodiness with kids and especially teenagers? Of course. And so rather than react with consternation, maybe we can react with a little more understanding. And then take some time in helping young people develop a positive identity. Can we dwell on what students do right instead of what they do wrong? So I'll tell you this, there's a basic tenet of human behavior, of basic psychology. And basically what it says is that the behaviors that we pay attention to we're going to get more of. So I think that's important. The behaviors that we pay attention to, we're going to get more of. So if we're always like redirecting kids or scolding kids, where we think that that's helping, most often it's getting attention for them, and it's something that they're going to repeat. So I'm not saying never redirect kids, but I am saying that when catch them doing something right, catch them doing something good, and make sure that we pay attention to that and we dwell on that as well. There's some resources that are available for families and parents to kind of learn more about this. And okay, so what this screen in front of you right now, they're personal resiliency builders and or, here's that word again, protective factors that facilitate resilience. So I want you to think about this just for a few seconds for yourself. So I want you to look over this list, and I want you to think about for yourself. I'm just going to give you about 20 or 30 seconds. Look over these lists and think about when something happens in your life. Maybe there's something unexpected happens that kind of knocks you off course, or constitutes even a crisis for you or a lot of stress. What are the top 3 things that you choose to go to? Because we all choose these things in some way. What are the 3 things you choose to help you move forward? Because we all keep moving forward, even in the face of everything that we've been dealt with our whole lives, right? And there's been a lot of turmoil in all of our lives. Look at these things, and what are the top 3 things? Okay, so I know that wasn't a lot of time, but the whole idea is to kind of have you look at this and to know, because we don't often do this. We're faced with some crisis in our life and we find a way to move on, right? But the thing is, we are also using these types of things to help us move on, whether we're really taking an account of it or not. So I know I like to use sense of humor. I like to use relationships, and I like to use inner direction. So make my choices based on things that I know that I have control over. So that's kind of how, like, what I choose. But each one of you might choose your own thing, and all of them are viable. So the other thing, I don't know if we're going to have time to do this tonight, because I see we only have 25 minutes left. But I want you to think about this little chart in front of you. All you have to do is put a line down in the middle of the paper. And on the one side are challenges. So I want you to think about a child in your life. And I want you to write down all the challenges that person has in their life, that young person has in their life. And then on the right side, I want you to write, what are the strengths that you know that person possesses? And you could look at the developmental assets, or you can look at the personal resiliency builders that were on the slide right before this. But I want you to kind of practice that, because what happens when we do this exercise with sometimes educators or people that work with young people, we'll ask them to list the challenges of somebody that's really tough for them right now. And then we'll ask them to do this. And what we find out is that they'll have like 10 or 12 challenges, and they'll have 2 or 3 strengths. And the thing is, we want to make sure that those strengths equal the challenges, because we might have to look a little bit deeper. We might have to look a little bit further for the strengths in an individual. But here's what we know about how people get better and how people overcome strife in their lives is by what's right with them, not by what's wrong with them. So that's something to remember too. So you can practice this, and you can use this little chart and just thinking about, you can even do it with yourself if you want. Maybe it's easier to practice just thinking about yourself. And then you can think about a child that, one of your children or somebody you're trying to help, and repeat that exercise and see what kind of things it brings up for you and what you might learn from it. I was going to move on in the 20 some minutes that we have left. I like this quote from Dr. Seuss, of all places. Sometimes the questions are complicated and the answers are simple, right? Sometimes we don't know what to ask. We don't know how to ask it, and I think that's so true. But this whole idea is that, our resilience, our ability to be resilient, it's been impacted in our lives by both positive and negative challenges, right? But we know this, like, for us as adults, maybe how we've handled a crisis in the past, it's going to impact how we might be handling this current, maybe COVID-19 or some other crisis that COVID-19 has helped create for us. So there's going to be you're going to also think about how you handled that thing in the past, either consciously or unconsciously. So they will have an impact on us, right? How we've handled situations. But that doesn't mean if we handled a situation poorly at one point in our life, it doesn't destine us to do poorly again. We can do better, but we have to be mindful about it, right? We have to think about how we can do better. But we know too that during stressful times, children will depend on parents, caregivers, teachers, other important adults in their lives for guidance and support. And refer back to my initial statement that we don't have to be perfect sages, right? We don't have to be perfect sages, but they will look to us too. And that's not easy, especially for teenagers. So when a teenager's going through a really stressful challenge, they don't want to admit that this is overwhelming for them. But they do look to us for support. So we're walking that thin line, right, of how do we provide support and still being cognizant of or aware of the fact that they're going to feel hesitant about it, asking for help. And of course, the other thing we know is that we're going to see age-related differences in how our children react to different situations. So make sure that you look at children developmentally, because if you have one child that's say in middle school or a teenager, and then you have a child that's in third or fourth grade, like they might not be experiencing, it might be the same situation, but they're experiencing it way different. So just remember that developmental lens to look at how kids might be behaving or acting differently. We know that with a child or adolescent, their ability to reason, especially during stressful times, may be a little bit thrown off. Like they may not accurately perceive or realize the true causes of what's going on with this situation. So here's the thing. That's why, for a long time, there was this school of thought that we shouldn't, and it was especially prevalent in schools. So I know I'm working in schools, and like maybe something would happen, a crisis or trauma would happen in a school. And the prevailing thought was, let's not talk about this with the kids because we're going to get them upset. And the thing is, what we know now is that we do need to talk to them about it in a developmentally appropriate way, because if we don't, and children start to hear about it on social media or through gossip, that they don't get the true picture of what happens, and they start to fill in the blanks with misinformation. So it's important to talk to our children in developmentally appropriate ways about what's going on in terms of changes or challenges that happen to a family or that may happen in their lives. So like the examples they use, like a young child with a parent in the military may not understand why a parent had to leave. They may think that the parent left because they misbehaved in some way, right? They'll call that magical thinking. That's the term that kind of applied to that. And so teenagers may interpret economic changes in the family and family purchases as an indication. In other words, if we don't buy them something they feel is important to them, that we don't value their wants and desires. So that's why it becomes important to explain Sometimes we need to refer back to the slide about boundaries. We need to have boundaries. Like children don't need to know every economic hardship that a family's going through. They don't need to know all that. But if they're asking for a certain item and it's outside of the budget, they need to be talked to about why it's outside of the budget and maybe what they could have instead. So hopefully that makes sense. I mean, and I think it does, but it just takes a concerted effort on our part. So the effects of uncertainty on kids, that's pretty pretty intense because children do really well, and adolescents do too. That's why earlier we talked about that idea of boundaries. The children do better when things are structured and predictable. And so when we took children out of the school year this past spring, that impacted them because their routines were upended. And I don't have to tell you that. I'm sure you saw as parents how that situation manifests itself in behaviors. But so the idea is that when we can, that we create opportunities for structure, even in times like these, which are maybe not structured as we'd like them to be. So the change is really impactful for children, especially. And children don't, children are resilient. There's no doubt about that. But sometimes they don't cope with changes very well. They don't cope with transitions very well. So that's not all children, because some really roll with it pretty well. Sometimes surprises us, I think. But again, they may see us struggling under the impact of change. And that's okay, because we're human beings. We're going to be impacted by change. So we don't have to pretend like it's not happening. But what becomes important in a situation like this is that we talk to our children about how we're reacting, how we're coping. So on a developmentally appropriate level, right? You don't need to tell them everything. But it basically comes down to modeling and talking to the children when we can about the impact of change. As this next slide indicates, children often view the world as black and white, right? So they don't see the ambiguity. They don't see the world as gray. And I'm sure you've seen this with kids. How about this almost exaggerated sense of fairness or justice that kids show sometimes? And they're really in tune to, why did my one brother or sister get something? I didn't get it. They got to watch TV this long and I didn't. You know how that goes. And they can be really honest about that too. They may not understand why certain things have to be done. So, and it's important to kind of explain that to them, or at least try, because sometimes we think children aren't getting it. Have you had that situation with your young person? Like you talk to them and you're like, oh, I don't know if this is kind of getting through to them or not. But it's almost like planting seeds, right? Like you have this conversation and maybe they don't get it for a while. Maybe they don't get it for weeks or months. But then a situation happens in their life and they're like, oh, I know why my mom or dad or my teacher was trying to explain that to me. So it's interesting like that. But like, especially when teenagers are really anxious about not knowing what is going on, it increases their anxiety, and it could result, I'm not saying it definitely will, but it could result in negative behaviors such as risk taking, right? And so some being mindful about talking with them is important. Time orientation is important especially for young kids. Like one thing that we'll do with young kids, they're not really good about time orientation at all. So we might use like a clock. You could have like a paper clock with the hands on the clock to say, this is when mommy and daddy are coming back, or this is when we're going to get to read your story, or this is when you go with your babysitter, whatever it will be. But that helps because it's concrete if you can have that. And then other people have used like a calendar, and a person can mark off the days, or they can have the days marked off when someone's going to be away or till something happens. So that's good to do with with younger kids especially. Um, okay, so this whole having limited life experience kind of goes along with, well, it goes along with another thing we're going to talk about, but having limited life experiences, they don't, children and adolescents don't have a lot of past experiences they can draw on to say, well, this is how well I coped before, and so I know I'm going to be able to cope again. This might be the first crisis they think they see in their lives. So we can help them with strategies to help them deal with their challenge. So just know that they're going to be wrestling with that, because our minds are programmed to kind of put things in logical order. So when a young person is dealing with a stressful event or a crisis event, their mind is going to be turning, even if they don't say that they are. Their mind are going to be kind of working to try to find strategies to cope. And so being aware of that, it's important to talk to them. Even if it looks like they're doing fine, right? Even if it looks like they're doing fine, it's important to talk to them about it. Okay. We know that the expression of thoughts and feelings, especially with younger people, we see this a lot, that young people will kind of use therapeutic play. It doesn't even have to be designed by us as adults. They will find ways to use therapeutic play to handle a situation. We know after I was a school counselor when the events of the terrorist attacks on September 11th hit, and there were parents that were asking me about, was their children going to be okay because they were setting up building blocks and knocking them over with planes, or pretending they were a plane and knocked them over. And parents were worried that there was going to be something wrong. But children will use therapeutic play to kind of work through their thoughts and feelings. And yeah, they'll, especially any stressful event that they're kind of exposed to, they may use play, or they may use some other types of behaviors, for example. But they can, children can become more aggressive. They can regress and become more clingy. They can act out. They can be like more withdrawn. It's going to run the gamut. But potentially those things are going to have an impact. And we know too, like stressful situations, like death of a pet. We used to place a way less significance on the death of a pet than we do now, because we know pets become part of the family, right? When there's a loss of a pet, that can be particularly impactful for a parent, for a family. But, the one thing we don't recommend is that you run out and replace the pet the next day and get another pet from a pet store. Because that's really not preparing kids for the realities of the world. And I know as parents, I can't tell you how many parents I know that did that. And you don't want your kid to be sad. You don't want them to, be tearful. But it is important to know that's impactful, but also to help them experience that. And I know one family I worked with, and this young girl had a bluebird. Well, the bluebird escaped one day. So what they did was they went to like 20 different pet stores till they found a bluebird that looked just like this bluebird that escaped. Then they came up with this story that one of their relatives found the bluebird 20 miles away. And so here the bluebird was back. But that just kind of illustrates the lengths that I think families will go to sometimes, that they don't want children to experience, the kind of grief that comes from a loss, but that it's important that they do that, but with supports. That there are going to be emotions present, even if they're not expressing them in words. They will be expressing them in some ways. It's a human interaction. It's a human process. Okay, so knowing that, how do we help children cope and build resilience? A family system is the primary source of support. Okay, so there's going to be a varying types of relationships within families, different beliefs and value systems. So all of those things that a child can learn in their families can potentially help them cope. And then there are other social systems, of course. There's extended systems, of course, school, childcare, extended family. faith groups, cultural groups, extracurricular activities. So all of those things help to provide structure and support. And so they can be seen as very important. You know, they want to change that term extracurricular in schools to co-curricular. So it's not just something extra they're doing, but it's part of the curriculum and just as important as those other things that they do. So that's something to remember, that all of those kind of things that children learn to do that help them be involved in recreation and leisure. I don't think that's the first thing that pops up in somebody's mind when they think about we're training a person to be a successful person. Recreation and leisure isn't the first thing that pops into somebody's head. However, it should really, because it becomes that important that they learn to have how to give themselves timeouts, how to give themselves a break from stress in their lives, healthy coping mechanisms. All of those things we know are so important now. How we manage our distress will affect how our children manage their stress. So again, we're not going to be perfect. We're in the middle of a crisis ourselves. We're not going to be acting in a perfect manner, you know, but if we can kind of be able to some degree, model or teach our kids that, you know, even that we're having a rough time, mommy and daddy are having a rough time right now, but here's what we're doing about it. Here's how we're going to make it through, those kind of things. Then kids don't have to fill in the blanks with often a lot more scary or worrisome magical thinking that they tend to do. So hopefully that makes sense, that we don't have to be perfect, but the way we handle something is going to impact how our children handle something, and vice versa. And this kind of summarizes that. You know, when a family's stressed, children are affected, right? When children are stressed, the family's affected. When parents work on building and maintaining their own resilience, they help children. When parents help their children cope, they manage their own stress. So I think it's really, and that is so true. And we don't often think about it this way, but try to think about it this way, because a family is a system. Some families are pretty well-run systems. Other of our families, well, I'd go as far as to say this: every family's dysfunctional in their own way, right? But if we kind of think about it this way, that it is a system, dysfunctional or not, we can help each other do a little bit better than we normally would do, just by paying attention to and supporting each other. Okay, so we don't have tons of time. I guess I talked too much this time, but you know, we can go. Here are the 10 tips for building resilience in children and teens, and there is also an explanation of each one of these. And a lot of them we talked about already, but there's a little bit more detailed explanation in the upcoming slides on this presentation. But you know, the ability to help children make connections, very important. The ability, I will tell you this about number 2, helping children and teens help other people. That is, we don't real often, like when you think about a teenager, the first thing that doesn't pop into your head is that, oh, they're so generous and kind and loving and helping. You know, usually that's not the first thing we think about when we think about teenage years. However, teenagers want this ability to help other people because it empowers them. They actually see that they have power in the world. So if you maybe introduce teenagers and children, by the way, because I worked in an elementary school, and we helped children get involved in different altruistic activities like fundraising and things like that. And once they started doing that, they never wanted to stop. Every week they were like, what can we do next? What can we do next? So that is really empowering. It's something that we can do as parents, but think about how we can help children and teens help other people. Okay, maintaining a daily routine, so important. Making sure that children know that it's okay to take a break. Because then you get people that are perfectionists, children who I see a lot of that. And perfectionism has its benefits. It also has its drawbacks. But even if they're not a perfectionist, make sure that they take a healthy break away from that activity, because that can make them more effective in doing whatever they're trying to whatever goal they have. So that goes along with self-care. We don't really think about teaching children self-care, but we know now that it's important. So help children and teens move towards their goals, help them see a positive view of themselves, and we can do that through the positive reinforcement we give them every day. Help them keep things in perspective, because kids can see problems as insurmountable. And as adults, we have more years behind us, and we know that troubled times come and go, and we can help them with that. Help them look for the opportunity to learn more about themselves through self-discovery, and help them understand that change is part of living. We know that, but kids expect things to stay the same. And when things change for kids, you're like, wow, I never thought this would change. So bear that in mind when we're helping them accept the fact that change is part of living.